The moment I first touched the saber, I knew something was wrong. It wasn't heavy in the way steel should be heavy. It was heavier in a way that didn't make sense, as if the weight wasn't in the metal but in the memory it carried, pressing back against my hand like an unwilling witness. They told me it came from Waterloo, from that single day in 1815 when Europe stopped pretending war was still controlled. But nobody ever explained why a simple cavalry saber could make a grown man hesitate before lifting it. I still remember the silence in the room where it was kept. Not the clean silence of an empty space, but the kind of silence that feels crowded, as if the air itself is waiting to speak and refuses to do so. There was no inscription worth mentioning, no royal marking, nothing that would normally turn a weapon into something worth remembering, and yet everyone who stood near it spoke more quietly than they intended. You could see it in their eyes, that small, instinctive pause, like they were trying not to imagine what had once happened around it, or what it had been forced to witness when the world outside that moment collapsed into smoke, noise, and confusion. They say artifacts are just objects pulled from history, but this one never felt pulled. It felt left behind on purpose, as if something about it was too difficult to carry forward without consequence. And what makes it worse is that no one agrees on when it stopped being just a weapon and started being something else entirely, something people would later describe as a symbol, though nobody can fully agree on what it was supposed to symbolize, only that it spread beyond the battlefield it came from and into conversations, letters, and whispered accounts across Europe in the years that followed. I was not supposed to ask questions about it, but questions have a way of forming when silence becomes too deliberate. And the more I learned, the more I realized that Waterloo was not just a battle that ended an era, it was a moment that left certain things unfinished in ways history books rarely admit. If you're watching this, stay with me, because what happened to this saber after it left the field of Waterloo is not something most accounts ever fully explain, and the truth behind it is buried deeper than the metal itself. So if you want to understand how a single object became something people still hesitate to speak about, consider subscribing and leave a comment if you've ever come across an artifact that felt like it carried more than just history. He was not a man of importance when the story began, just one among many carried forward by a war that no longer distinguished between individuals, only roles and outcomes. And yet, it was his hands that first held the saber during the days when Europe still believed the conflict could be measured, contained, and ultimately resolved in the language of orders and formations. He never described himself as brave, not once in the fragments of accounts that survived him. But there was a certain silence in the way he spoke about that period. A silence that suggested not absence of memory, but selective survival of it. The saber was already old by the time it reached him, older than the man who carried it, older even than the system of conflict that had produced Waterloo. Yet it had not lost its presence, and those who encountered it seemed to notice that before anything else, as if the object resisted being reduced to a simple tool. In the weeks leading up to the confrontation that would later define its association with history, there were reports of unusual tension across the region, not in the sense of grand declarations or official announcements, but in smaller details: disrupted supply routes, shifting movements of mounted units, and the growing sense that the landscape itself had become unstable in ways that were difficult to quantify. The saber, according to later accounts, changed hands more than once during this period, passing between officers who left behind only partial records, each transfer unremarkable on paper, yet increasingly significant in hindsight. What makes this fragment of history difficult to interpret is not the lack of documentation, but the overwhelming presence of it, as if every surviving note attempts to describe the same object from a slightly different emotional distance, none of them fully willing to commit to what it represented. When the larger confrontation finally unfolded, it did so with the kind of speed that makes recollection unreliable, where sequences blur and cause becomes indistinguishable from effect. And in that environment, the saber ceased to function as a simple instrument and instead became something observers repeatedly struggled to categorize. Some described it as belonging to tradition, others as belonging to chaos, and a few avoided describing it at all, as if naming it would force an explanation they were not prepared to give. It is important to understand that nothing about this period was isolated. Every movement influenced another. Every decision created consequences that extended far beyond the immediate moment. And yet the saber remained oddly central, not because it changed the outcome, but because it seemed to persist through it without losing its identity. In later correspondence recovered from the era, there are brief references to it appearing in unexpected places, never framed as extraordinary in the moment, but always remembered that way afterward, as though its presence carried a weight that only became visible once it was gone. I have often wondered whether it was the object itself that held significance, or whether it was the human need to attach meaning to something that survived when so much else did not. And that question remains unresolved in every account that follows its path beyond Waterloo. The deeper I followed the trail of the saber, the more I began to understand that its story was never truly about the object itself, but about the way people reacted to it when they believed no one else was watching. In the surviving correspondence from the years after Waterloo, there are repeated references to a gradual shift in how officers and collectors describe certain items recovered from the battlefield, as if something about that period had made them more aware of the emotional weight carried by physical remnants of war. The saber appears in these documents not as a centerpiece, but as a recurring detail, mentioned almost casually in inventories and transfer logs, yet always surrounded by language that suggests hesitation. One account describes it as having been kept in a secured chest during transport across regions that were still stabilizing after the conflict, though there is no indication that any formal order required such precautions. What stands out most is not what was done with the object, but how often people felt compelled to note that it was still present, still unchanged, still carrying the same unsettling sense of permanence that had been observed earlier. As it moved farther from the original battlefield, the saber entered a different kind of existence, one shaped less by military context and more by private interpretation. In private collections, it was no longer discussed in terms of tactics or outcomes, but in terms of atmosphere, as if its presence altered the space around it in ways that were difficult to articulate without sounding uncertain. Some observers wrote that it seemed to draw attention without demanding it, while others avoided keeping it on display for long periods, preferring instead to store it away without explanation. This pattern of behavior, repeated across different locations and individuals, contributed to a growing body of informal narratives that surrounded the object, narratives that were never officially confirmed, yet persisted through oral accounts and personal letters. The more I examined these fragments, the more I noticed a consistent absence, not of information but of final interpretation, as if every attempt to define the saber's significance collapsed under the weight of its own assumptions. Even within academic circles of the time, where one might expect a more restrained approach, there is evidence of reluctance to categorize it in purely historical terms, as though doing so would strip away something that could not be replaced. It is in this space between documentation and hesitation that the story begins to take on its most unusual form, because the saber does not behave like a conventional artifact of war, which is typically measured by origin, use, and preservation, but instead seems to accumulate meaning through the reactions of those who encounter it. And as I continued to trace its path forward, it became increasingly clear that what people feared was not what the saber had done, but what it represented when placed into silence, away from the noise of the battlefield where everything else could be explained. The further the record fades from the immediate aftermath of Waterloo, the more fragmented its traces become, as if the saber itself had entered a period of historical drift where its physical presence remained constant, but its meaning continued to shift depending on who attempted to define it. In one set of administrative notes dated years after the conflict, the object is listed alongside ordinary military equipment. Yet a marginal annotation describes it as unusually retained for observation, a phrase that appears nowhere else in similar inventories of the period. That small detail, almost insignificant at first glance, becomes increasingly important when cross-referenced with private correspondence from individuals who claim to have encountered it during its transfer between holdings. These accounts do not agree on the circumstances, but they converge on a single impression, that the saber was never treated as entirely interchangeable with other artifacts of war. There is one letter in particular that stands out, written by an unnamed curator who describes the experience of cataloging it as uncomfortable in a way that cannot be explained by condition or age, and then immediately corrects himself in a later draft, removing the phrase without explanation. It is in these subtle revisions that the story begins to reveal its true complexity, because the hesitation is more consistent than the content itself. As the saber moved through different hands, it also moved through different interpretations, each shaped by the cultural and political environment of its temporary location. In some regions, it was framed as a relic of military transformation, a reminder of how rapidly European warfare had evolved during the early 19th century. In others, it was treated as a cautionary object, placed in restricted collections where only selected individuals were permitted to view it under supervision. Yet even in these controlled environments, there are repeated mentions of visitors leaving without offering clear explanations for their reactions, often declining to discuss what they had seen beyond acknowledging that it felt different from other historical objects. What emerges from this pattern is not a single narrative, but a layered accumulation of perception, where each observer contributes a small fragment of meaning without ever completing the whole. This fragmentation becomes especially significant when considering how quickly stories began to form around the saber outside official records, spreading through informal channels among collectors, historians, and military observers who treated it less as a documented artifact and more as a point of interpretive uncertainty. These stories did not always agree, but they shared a consistent tendency to emphasize its persistence, as if the object resisted being fully explained or fully dismissed. Over time, this resistance itself became part of its identity, reinforcing the idea that certain remnants of conflict do not simply record history, but continue to participate in how history is remembered and discussed. And as I continued to examine its trajectory through these overlapping accounts, I began to understand that the true transformation was not in the saber's physical condition, which remained largely unchanged, but in the human need to assign it meaning that kept expanding beyond the boundaries of what could be clearly proven. As the historical trace of the saber continued to drift forward in time, something unusual began to emerge that could not be explained by ownership records or catalog systems alone, because the object no longer behaved like something that simply moved from one collection to another, but instead seemed to accumulate a pattern of avoidance around it, as if institutions themselves were unsure how closely they wanted to associate with it. In several documented cases, the saber was relocated without formal announcements, transferred under vague administrative categories that avoided detailed descriptions, and stored in conditions that were noticeably more cautious than those applied to comparable artifacts from the same period. What makes this pattern significant is not any single decision, but the consistency of hesitation across different regions and different generations of curators, suggesting that the uncertainty surrounding the object was not isolated, but shared across independent systems of historical preservation. There is a recurring reference in archival summaries to what is described as non-standard handling protocol, a phrase that appears without explanation and is never expanded upon in subsequent documentation, yet it reappears in multiple unrelated contexts separated by decades. During my own review of these materials, I noticed that whenever the saber was mentioned in broader historical discussions, it was rarely positioned as a central object of analysis, even when the surrounding subject matter would normally justify closer examination of material culture. Instead, it appears almost indirectly, referenced in footnotes, appended notes, or secondary descriptions that avoid direct engagement with its significance. This absence of direct interpretation is itself revealing, because it suggests a kind of intellectual caution that persisted even in academic environments that typically favor classification and clarity. At one point in the mid-19th century, there is evidence that an attempt was made to formally standardize its historical categorization. But the proposal was ultimately left unresolved, with reviewers noting that existing frameworks were insufficient to fully describe its role within the broader context of post-Waterloo Europe. This failure to categorize it did not diminish interest in the object, but rather shifted the nature of that interest from analysis toward observation, as if scholars preferred to record its presence rather than define its meaning. Over time, this approach contributed to a subtle but persistent mythologization process, not driven by dramatic storytelling, but by the accumulation of unresolved descriptions that left gaps large enough for interpretation to expand into. Even in later centuries, when historical methodology became more structured and evidence-based, the saber continued to resist complete integration into conventional narratives, appearing occasionally in exhibitions or private discussions, but almost always accompanied by disclaimers that emphasized uncertainty or incompleteness. What becomes increasingly clear through all these fragmented records is that the saber's significance is not anchored in a single event or moment, but in the sustained inability of successive generations to fully settle its meaning. And it is within that ongoing uncertainty that its most enduring historical presence seems to have taken shape. As I continued tracing the saber through the later layers of archival silence, I began to notice that its most unusual characteristic was not how often it appeared in historical records, but how often it disappeared from them at critical moments, where documentation would normally be expected to increase. Entire stretches of its recorded existence contain gaps that are not explained by loss or damage, but by the absence of any formal attempt to describe its location or condition, as if certain institutions collectively chose not to acknowledge its presence during specific periods. In one particularly detailed archival index from the late 19th century, there is a single line entry noting that the object was temporarily withdrawn from public reference, a phrase that carries no procedural explanation and is never used again in similar records. What makes this significant is not the withdrawal itself, but the lack of any corresponding return notice, suggesting that its reintegration into public cataloging occurred without formal acknowledgement. During this phase of its history, references to the saber become increasingly indirect, often appearing in correspondence between individuals who are clearly aware of its existence but deliberately avoid naming it explicitly, instead using vague descriptors that imply shared understanding without committing to documentation. This pattern of partial reference creates a strange duality, where the object is simultaneously present in historical consciousness and absent from official record, existing in a space defined more by implication than by confirmation. As I examined these materials, I began to see that this behavior was not random, but consistent enough to suggest a broader institutional discomfort that persisted across different administrative systems and historical periods. Even in contexts where cataloging standards were highly developed, there remained a reluctance to assign the saber a stable classification, as if any fixed definition would fail to capture something essential about its historical trajectory. In later summaries compiled by historians attempting retrospective analysis, the object is often described in terms of interpretive instability, a phrase that appears repeatedly without resolution, indicating that even modern scholarship struggles to fully contain its meaning within conventional frameworks. There are also accounts from museum settings where the saber was briefly displayed, only to be removed from exhibition without public explanation, accompanied by internal notes that reference curatorial reassessment, though no details are provided regarding what prompted such decisions. These repeated cycles of visibility and withdrawal contribute to an overall pattern that is difficult to interpret through standard historical methodology, because the evidence does not point toward a single cause, but rather toward a sustained hesitation that spans generations. What emerges from this accumulation of fragmented documentation is not a clearer understanding of the saber itself, but a growing recognition that its historical presence has always been mediated by avoidance, and that the most consistent feature of its journey is not what was said about it, but what was repeatedly left unsaid. By the time the saber's record enters what could be described as its most abstract historical phase, the documentation surrounding it no longer behaves like a continuous timeline, but rather like a series of disconnected reflections, each one attempting to justify its existence without fully acknowledging the others. In this stage, the object is no longer primarily discussed in terms of movement between collections or institutions, but instead becomes a reference point within broader interpretive discussions about memory, inheritance, and the way physical remnants of conflict persist long after the events that produced them have faded from living memory. What is particularly striking in these later analyses is the increasing tendency to treat the saber not as an isolated artifact, but as part of a larger pattern of objects from the same era that appear to resist stable interpretation. Scholars writing in the early 20th century occasionally grouped it with other battlefield remnants from the Napoleonic period, not because of shared physical characteristics, but because of shared interpretive difficulty, as if the inability to fully define these objects had itself become a meaningful category of study. In one notable academic review, the saber is described as persistently resistant to closure, a phrase that reappears in slightly modified forms across multiple publications, suggesting a growing awareness that conventional descriptive language was insufficient to capture the complexity of its historical reception. During this period, the object also begins to appear in philosophical discussions concerning the relationship between material culture and collective memory, where it is often used as an example of how physical objects can accumulate meaning independent of their original function or context. These discussions do not resolve the uncertainty surrounding the saber, but instead expand it, introducing new layers of interpretation that move further away from its tangible origins while remaining anchored to its perceived presence. At the same time, there are occasional attempts to reintroduce it into more structured historical narratives, particularly in exhibitions and curated collections focused on the evolution of European warfare. Yet even in these controlled environments, explanatory texts frequently emphasize the incompleteness of available information, as if acknowledging that any definitive statement would oversimplify the object's significance. What emerges from this accumulation of scholarly hesitation, philosophical framing, and curatorial caution is a consistent pattern in which the saber functions less as a defined artifact and more as a point of unresolved inquiry, repeatedly approached but never fully contained by the frameworks used to describe it. It is within this persistent state of interpretive suspension that its presence in historical discourse becomes most pronounced, not because it reveals a final truth, but because it continuously resists the formation of one. In the final stage of the historical record, the saber no longer appears as an active subject of inquiry, but instead as a residual presence embedded within the way history itself is written, as if its long documented ambiguity had altered not only how it was perceived, but how it influenced the structure of interpretation applied to similar artifacts from the same era. By this point, references to it are often indirect to the point of abstraction, appearing in comparative studies that examine how 19th century Europe constructed meaning around objects of conflict without necessarily relying on their original battlefield function. In these discussions, the saber is frequently invoked as a case study in what some historians describe as durable interpretive residue, a condition in which an object continues to shape analytical frameworks even when direct evidence becomes fragmented or incomplete. What is important here is not the accuracy of any single claim about the object, but the cumulative effect of its repeated reappearance across disciplines that do not typically intersect, including cultural history, archival theory, and the study of collective memory formation. In one particularly influential synthesis published in the mid-20th century, the saber is used to illustrate how physical remnants of war can evolve into what is described as reference objects, meaning they function less as sources of factual certainty and more as anchors for interpretive discussion. This shift marks a significant transition in how the object is treated, because it is no longer evaluated on the basis of what it can confirm about the past, but rather on what it reveals about the limitations of historical certainty itself. Within this framework, the saber becomes a kind of methodological mirror, reflecting back the assumptions and uncertainties of those who study it, rather than offering stable information about its own origin or journey. Even in more recent scholarship, where advances in documentation and archival reconstruction have significantly reduced uncertainty in many areas of Napoleonic studies, the Saber continues to resist full integration into definitive narratives, not because of missing evidence, but because of the persistent variability in how that evidence is interpreted. This has led some researchers to suggest that its significance lies not in any singular historical function, but in its long-term role as an object that consistently destabilizes attempts at closure. As I reached the end of this investigative path, it became clear that the Saber's true legacy is not located in a final explanation, but in the continuous process of reinterpretation it has generated across generations, leaving behind not a resolved story, but an enduring framework of uncertainty through which the memory of Waterloo and its surrounding era continues to be reconsidered. In the final reflections that surround the Saber, what remains most difficult to reconcile is not its documented history, but the fact that after centuries of analysis, classification, reinterpretation, and repeated archival review, it still resists any form of complete intellectual settlement. Every attempt to define it more precisely has only added another layer of uncertainty, as if each generation of inquiry contributes not clarity, but additional distance from certainty itself. In the most recent academic discussions I was able to trace, the Saber is no longer treated as an object that can be fully understood through traditional historical methods, but rather as a phenomenon that exposes the limits of those methods when applied to artifacts that accumulate meaning across time in irregular and unpredictable ways. Some scholars describe it as a persistent interpretive echo, suggesting that its significance is not located in the object itself, but in the recurring inability of observers to reach consensus about what it represents. What is striking is that even this formulation does not resolve the ambiguity. It simply reframes it, shifting the question from what the Saber was to why it continues to generate disagreement whenever it is studied. In museum contexts, it is often mentioned only in relation to discussions about curatorial restraint, as if its most important contribution to historical practice is the caution it imposes on those who attempt to display it without acknowledging its unresolved status. There are records of exhibitions where it was included in thematic collections about early 19th century warfare, yet always accompanied by explanatory language that emphasizes incompleteness rather than conclusion, as though the object itself resists being placed into a final narrative position. Even in private collections, where historical framing is less formal, accounts persist of individuals who ultimately chose to remove it from display after periods of extended observation, not due to physical deterioration or external pressure, but due to what they described in vague terms as a growing sense of interpretive discomfort. Across all these accounts, spanning centuries and multiple intellectual traditions, one pattern remains constant: the inability to finalize its meaning without encountering new forms of uncertainty that immediately reopen the question. And so I find myself returning to the same unresolved point that appears again and again throughout the entire historical record, wondering whether the Saber's true significance lies in anything it actually was, or instead in the fact that after everything we have learned, it still refuses to become only one thing, leaving behind a silence that feels less like absence and more like something still waiting to be understood.